I wasn't looking for evidence of a forgotten people when this began. I was cataloguing unusual architectural features, oddly proportioned doorways, staircases too steep for comfort, furniture seemingly designed for larger bodies, details you notice, label as stylistic choices, and move on from. What I didn't expect was how quickly this stopped feeling like curiosity and started feeling like something I wasn't supposed to notice. Then I found something that shifted everything. Photographs, not illustrations or folklore, but real photographs from the 1860s through the 1890s, showing human beings 8, 9, sometimes 10 feet tall. These weren't circus curiosities. They were formal studio portraits, individuals in period clothing, often posed beside people of average height for scale. At first, the proportions suggested manipulation or early photographic trickery, but the images predated any technology capable of producing convincing forgeries. The grain patterns matched. The lighting was consistent, shadows fell correctly, and yet the institutions that should have questioned them didn't. They archived the images quietly, without explanation, as if they were never meant to be examined too closely. That's when it became clear the architectural anomalies weren't aesthetic choices. They were functional designs, built for people who no longer appear in our historical narrative. The real question isn't whether they existed, but why their presence was allowed to disappear from the historical record. Let's start with what already exists in photographic archives, not rumors or private collections, but material held by major institutions. The British Museum preserves portraits from the 1870s, showing individuals of extraordinary height dressed formally, while Smithsonian collections contain similar images, catalogued with minimal context and rarely displayed. French provincial archives hold cabinet cards depicting unusually tall men and women in ordinary social settings, and Russian imperial records reference individuals of exceptional stature in administrative roles, accompanied by photographic documentation. These images are not isolated curiosities. They form a pattern appearing across multiple countries within a narrow historical window, roughly 1850 to 1900, before fading almost entirely from the record after the turn of the century. What makes this significant isn't simply exceptional height, which does occur naturally, but how these individuals are presented. They are not framed as spectacles or labeled as oddities. Instead, they are dressed in formal attire and photographed in official or administrative contexts, standing before institutional buildings or seated at furniture scaled to their imposing frames. What's striking is the lack of explanation. The photographers made no apparent effort to contextualize what they were documenting, as if the subjects required no justification. That absence suggests these individuals were familiar enough to be unremarkable to the people recording them. Contemporary newspaper accounts reinforce this impression. References to unusually tall individuals appear in municipal records, official registers, and administrative documents describing supervisory roles. These aren't sensational stories, but matter-of-fact mentions indicating positions of authority, overseeing construction projects, managing facilities, and supervising infrastructure. Now consider how institutional scholarship has handled this material. The images exist, properly archived, catalogued, and preserved, yet they are rarely exhibited, seldom analyzed, and almost never discussed in academic literature. There is no formal rebuttal, no sustained debate, not denial, but something quieter, a shared decision that these images do not merit deeper attention. This is where the photographic record becomes inseparable from architectural history. Many of these portraits place individuals in front of buildings whose proportions seem excessive by modern standards, but suddenly coherent when these figures are placed in frame. Doorways measuring 12 to 15 feet appear not at ceremonial entrances, but along working corridors where symbolism serves no purpose. Staircases feature risers that require uncomfortable stretching for average height occupants, and interior spaces have ceiling heights that feel subtly wrong for typical use. The conventional explanation attributes this to architectural fashion, a 19th century preference for imposing civic design. But that explanation weakens when context is examined more closely. We are not talking exclusively about monuments or symbolic facades, but courthouses, administrative offices, and government facilities across Europe, Russia, India, and the Americas. These buildings were constructed within a compressed time frame and display remarkably similar proportions, despite being attributed to supposedly independent architects and local traditions. In St. Petersburg, Administrative buildings contain back corridors with 12-foot doors, areas never intended for public access. In Buenos Aires, municipal structures feature staircases requiring strides too long for comfortable use. In Delhi, colonial-era government buildings supposedly designed for British administrators contain furniture scaled as if occupants stood significantly taller than surviving records suggest. These were not showcase spaces. They were working environments where daily operations occurred. The oversized proportions make them less functional for average height occupants, not more impressive, unless the intended users were not average-sized. At this point, the anomalies require a framework. Tartaria appears on cartographic records throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries, not as legend, but as mapped territory spanning large regions of northern Asia, referenced in contemporary encyclopedias with the same certainty applied to recognized nations. During the mid-19th century, it vanishes, not through conquest or renaming, but through systematic omission. Maps are revised, encyclopedias updated, and references quietly removed. What makes this relevant is that architectural characteristics associated with regions labeled as Tartarian, specific proportions, and construction techniques appear in institutional buildings worldwide during precisely the period Tartaria is being erased from official records. Identical proportions emerge across continents in buildings supposedly designed in isolation. So the question becomes difficult to ignore. What if these photographs do not depict medical anomalies at all, but document a distinct population serving defined functions within a social structure we've been taught did not exist? What if oversized architecture was not symbolic grandeur, but practical accommodation? And what if Tartaria employed individuals of exceptional height, not as curiosities, but as administrators, overseers, and construction supervisors? What if the photographic and architectural evidence we're left with represents fragments of that system, while the people themselves were quietly removed from later narratives? I'm not presenting this as settled history. I'm asking whether this framework accounts for the observable patterns more coherently than accepting that dozens of unrelated institutions independently made the same architectural decisions for purely aesthetic reasons. Physical artifacts strengthen this pattern. Chairs with seat heights of 30 to 36 inches, nearly double the standard for average leg length, appear not as ceremonial thrones, but as ordinary working furniture found in administrative buildings, with back heights reaching 7 or 8 feet. Museum catalogues describe them as oversized Victorian design without addressing why such impractical furniture appears in functional offices, or why it continues to surface in architectural salvage more than a century later. Then there are the tools, wrenches measuring 4 to 6 feet, bearing wear patterns consistent with regular use, and hand tools scaled for grip strength far exceeding normal human capability. These are not display pieces, someone used them. Museums categorize them as industrial equipment without explaining what human-operated processes would require tools of that scale rather than mechanical systems. 19th century newspapers also reported discoveries of human skeletal remains significantly larger than average. Not tabloid sensationalism, but mainstream publications. The New York Times in 1885 described skeletons measuring 7 to 9 feet from Michigan burial mounds. The San Diego Union in 1895 reported bones of extraordinary size uncovered during railroad construction. The Middletown Signal in 1899 covered remains measuring up to 12 feet discovered in Ohio. These accounts describe organized burial sites, often accompanied by artifacts suggesting advanced metallurgical knowledge. Then, after roughly 1920, such reports abruptly cease. Many of these remains were reportedly sent to the Smithsonian for study. Today, the institution maintains that no such specimens exist in its collections, lost during transfers, misplaced in reorganizations, or discarded during moves. Hundreds of documented specimens vanished without adequate records. The timing is difficult to dismiss. Photographic evidence clusters between 1850 and 1900. Newspaper reports of skeletal discoveries peak in the same decades. Architectural construction featuring oversized proportions concentrates in this period. Tartaria's removal from geographic records occurs simultaneously. After 1900, everything stops. The photographs disappear, the reports end, and architectural proportions normalize. How do we explain this convergence? Multiple forms of evidence, photographic, architectural, archaeological, and cartographic, emerging together and then receding together. The conventional explanation asks us to accept coincidence, that photographers documented tall individuals while architects independently built oversized spaces, that newspapers reported giant discoveries and then inexplicably stopped, that maps were revised for unrelated reasons, and that physical evidence was coincidentally lost through repeated institutional failures. Or we consider an alternative, that these are not separate anomalies, but interconnected evidence scholarship has chosen not to pursue, that individuals of exceptional height existed in sufficient numbers to represent a distinct population, that architecture was scaled to accommodate them as primary occupants, and that their disappearance from records reflects deliberate narrative adjustment rather than natural demographic change. This does not prove a conclusion, but it does establish that something happened, something our standard explanations do not adequately account for. The distribution of oversized architecture offers one of the clearest clues. These proportions don't appear randomly. They concentrate in government buildings, courthouses, administrative centers, and facilities tied to large-scale construction and infrastructure oversight. Residential architecture from the same era remains human-scaled. Commercial spaces maintain familiar proportions, but spaces associated with authority, supervision, and governance consistently display the oversized characteristics we've been examining. That pattern points toward functional specialization rather than aesthetic preference. If the goal was civic impressiveness, the most extreme proportions would appear at public entrances and ceremonial halls. Instead, they appear in back corridors, working offices, and administrative spaces inaccessible to the general public, areas designed for daily use by the people who actually occupied them. Historical records that mention individuals of unusual stature place them in supervisory roles with striking consistency. Oversight of construction projects, management of facilities, administration of infrastructure work. These were not symbolic titles. They were functional positions requiring physical presence, authority over large crews, and the ability to operate within spaces built at monumental scale. That raises uncomfortable questions about construction itself. How were massive stone structures built with such precision when conventional history tells us the available technology was limited? What if the answer isn't lost techniques, but scale? What if the people directing, inspecting, and approving this work were physically capable of interacting with materials and structures in ways human-scale laborers simply could not? A 9-foot individual with proportional strength would fundamentally change the equation. Stones weighing several hundred pounds become difficult rather than prohibitive. Tools requiring extreme grip strength become usable. Heights that demand scaffolding for ordinary workers become reachable from the ground. The engineering challenges don't disappear, but they become far less mysterious. This also explains why the photographic record places these individuals in formal contexts rather than manual labor. They weren't laborers, they were on-site supervisors and overseers, figures of authority whose physical scale allowed them to directly inspect, direct, and control large construction operations in real time. The pattern of erasure that follows is too consistent to dismiss as accident. Photographs are archived but not displayed. Skeletal remains are sent to institutions, then lost without documentation. Newspaper reports simply stop, despite continued excavation and development. Maps are revised to remove territorial references. This isn't passive neglect. It's systematic removal of evidence that complicates the accepted narrative. What's most unsettling isn't the evidence itself, but the institutional response to it. Academic institutions don't debate the photographs, they simply don't discuss them. Museums don't deny oversized furniture exists. They label it decorative and place it beyond public scrutiny. Archaeological societies don't dispute 19th century newspaper reports. They quietly set them aside as irrelevant. It's passive erasure. Questions that aren't asked, evidence that isn't examined, patterns that aren't connected, because connecting them leads somewhere uncomfortable. And that brings us back to the question that matters most. Why? Why did individuals of extraordinary height exist in sufficient numbers to be regularly photographed and buried in organized sites? Why does their documentation cluster in the same decades Tartaria disappears from official records? Why does architecture from this period accommodate their proportions so precisely? Why do tools and furniture scaled for their use continue to surface more than a century later? And why does all of it vanish from the historical record after 1900? I began this investigation cataloging architectural curiosities, I'm ending it confronting questions about what we've been taught to forget. These weren't monsters from mythology. They were people, individuals with faces, families, and social roles documented clearly enough that photographers saw no need to explain their presence. We've made them impossible by denying they were ever real. We've turned documented evidence into forbidden speculation, and in doing so, we've lost more than their story. We've lost understanding of what we inherited. The massive doorways still stand. Oversized furniture sits in storage. Tools continue to surface in demolition salvage. Photographs remain in archives. Physical evidence of a social structure we're told never existed persists all around us. Walk into any 19th century government building. Notice how doorways tower overhead, how staircases require awkward stretching, how the proportions feel subtly wrong for human scale. Ask yourself whether these spaces were truly designed for people your size, or whether we've simply adapted to environments built for someone else. The evidence is everywhere, waiting for anyone willing to look without institutional filters. What we've been taught to dismiss as medical anomalies, decorative excess, and aesthetic choices may instead represent functional architecture, working furniture, operational tools, and documented individuals who serve specific roles in systems we're no longer supposed to remember. The question isn't whether giants existed. The photographic and physical evidence establishes that they did. The real question is what function they served, what civilization they belonged to, and why every trace of them was systematically removed from our historical narrative when that civilization disappeared from official recognition.